I didn't know a single moment could rewrite a life until the night I dropped a tray and looked into the eyes of a man who didn't blink like everyone else. My name is Emily Carter, and I was just a waitress working a late shift at Blackwood Lounge in downtown Chicago, trying to survive on tips, rent notices, and 6 hours of sleep if I was lucky. That night started like any other Friday. Too many guests, too much noise, and the kind of luxury crowd that never looked at people like me unless we were serving them. I kept my head down, repeating orders in my mind like a mantra, careful not to spill anything, careful not to exist too loudly. Then the VIP section filled, and everything changed. For men arrived first, all sharp suits and quiet authority, the kind that made conversations drop a few degrees when they passed. I didn't know their names then, but I felt it immediately, that invisible weight of power that didn't need to announce itself. And then he came in, Ethan Blackwell. I didn't know who he was at the time, only that the room reacted before I did. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, chairs straightening, voices lowering, security shifting positions like they were suddenly on alert. He didn't look around like most people do when they enter a place. He already knew everything he needed to know. I remember thinking he looked too calm for someone everyone else seemed to fear. Too controlled. Too still. Like nothing in the room could surprise him. I tried to ignore them, to keep moving, to do my job the way I always did. But every time I passed their table, I felt it. That strange awareness of being watched without anyone actually turning their head. It wasn't until I reached for a glass and my sleeve caught slightly on the edge of the tray that everything shifted. A small mistake, something I would normally laugh off later, suddenly felt like the loudest moment in the room. I froze, waiting for the usual irritation, the complaints, the dismissal. Instead, the entire table went quiet. Not because of me, but because of him. Ethan had looked up. Not quickly, not surprised, just focused, like he had been waiting for something exactly like this. He didn't speak right away. He didn't move. And somehow that silence felt heavier than any reaction I could have prepared for. When his eyes met mine, I felt it, an uncomfortable certainty that I wasn't just serving a table anymore. I was being noticed in a way that had nothing to do with my job. And I didn't know it yet. But that was the exact moment everything in my life stopped being mine. I did not move at first, because when his eyes stayed on me, it felt like the rest of the room had lost its meaning, like sound itself had been turned down and I was the only thing still in focus. I told myself to keep working, to keep breathing, to keep acting normal, but normal suddenly felt like something I had forgotten how to do. The tray in my hands suddenly felt heavier, and every step I took across the polished floor felt like I was walking through a space that no longer belonged to me. My manager called my name twice before I even realized he was speaking. His voice sounded far away, like it was coming from the other side of a wall. He gestured toward the VIP section, and I saw it immediately in his expression, that careful politeness that people use when they are about to ask you to do something they do not fully understand. "They are requesting you specifically," he said quietly. I blinked, unsure I had heard correctly. That kind of request did not happen to someone like me. I wiped my hands on my apron, trying to slow my heartbeat, and force myself to walk forward. Each step felt measured, unnatural, like I was entering a space that had already decided the outcome before I arrived. When I reached the edge of the table, the conversation stopped without anyone announcing it. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a natural fading, like the room itself was choosing silence. Ethan Blackwell did not look surprised to see me. That was the first thing that unsettled me. It was not curiosity in his eyes. It was recognition, like I had already been accounted for in his thoughts long before I ever stood in front of him. I placed the menus down carefully, trying to focus on something ordinary, but the air around him made everything feel different. He spoke my name before I introduced myself. "Emily Carter," he said calmly, as if he had said it many times before. I froze for half a second, because I had never told him my name. I was certain of it. I nodded anyway, because I did not know what else to do. One of his associates shifted slightly in his seat, but Ethan raised his hand just enough for the movement to stop. It was subtle, almost invisible, but everything obeyed it. That was when I understood this was not a normal table, not a normal group of guests, not a normal night. This was control expressed without effort. He leaned back slightly, studying me the way someone studies something they already intend to understand completely. "You are not supposed to be here long term," he said, not as a question, but as a fact. I did not respond. My mind was trying to catch up with the tone of the conversation, with the way he spoke as if he already knew my schedule, my job, my limits. I asked if they needed anything from the menu, because it was the only thing I could think to say that sounded professional. He did not answer the question. Instead, he folded his hands on the table and looked at me in a way that made my stomach tighten for reasons I could not explain. "Do you know what kind of place this is?" he asked. I hesitated. Of course I knew. A high-end lounge for wealthy clients. At least, that was what I thought I knew. But the way he said it made me unsure. Before I could answer, my manager appeared behind me again, quieter this time, his face slightly pale. He leaned in and said something that made my breath catch. "Emily, just follow them for a moment." I turned back toward the table, confused, and Ethan stood up slowly. Not rushed, not impatient, just certain. He adjusted his jacket and met my eyes again, and for the first time, I saw something different behind his calm expression. Not anger, not warmth, something closer to decision. "You will come with me," he said simply, like it was already settled. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer being asked to serve a table. I was being asked to step into a life I had never agreed to, and somehow, I could not find the words to say no. I remember walking after him because my body moved before my mind could decide otherwise, and every step away from the dining floor felt like I was crossing an invisible line I could never return from. The noise of the lounge faded behind me as Ethan Blackwell led the way without turning back even once, as if he already knew I would follow. My manager did not stop me. No one did. That silence bothered me more than anything else. We passed through a side corridor I had never noticed before, even after months of working there, and the lighting changed from warm gold tones to a colder, more controlled white. It did not feel like a restaurant anymore. It felt like a place built for decisions that were not meant to be questioned. I finally stopped walking when we reached a private room at the end of the hallway. Ethan opened the door and gestured for me to enter. I hesitated for only a second before stepping inside, because hesitation suddenly felt like something dangerous in his presence. The room was simple, almost minimal, but everything in it looked intentional. A long table, 2 chairs, no decorations, no distractions. He closed the door behind me, and the sound was soft, but it made my heart tighten anyway. I turned to face him, expecting an explanation, or at least some kind of reason, but he did not offer either. Instead, he walked to the table and placed something on it. A folded document. I did not need to see it to feel what it was meant to represent. "Sit," he said calmly. It was not a command said loudly. It was quieter than that, which somehow made it harder to refuse. I sat. My hands were cold now, resting in my lap, trying to stay still. Ethan remained standing for a moment, watching me as if he was measuring something that could not be seen on paper. Then he finally spoke again. "You are not in danger here," he said. I did not answer immediately, because I was not sure I believed him, and I was not sure I understood why I should trust a stranger who had just taken me away from everything familiar. He noticed my silence and nodded slightly, like he expected it. Then he pushed the document closer to me. "This is not what you think it is," he added. I looked down at the paper, but I did not open it. My mind was still trying to process how quickly my night had shifted from serving tables to sitting across from a man who seemed to control the entire building without raising his voice. I finally asked the only question I could manage. "Why me?" My voice sounded smaller than I expected, but it was steady enough. Ethan studied me for a long moment before answering. "Because you were not supposed to see what you saw," he said simply. That answer did not make sense to me at first, and I felt a tightening in my chest as I tried to understand what he meant. I had not seen anything unusual. I had only been working, only serving drinks, only existing in the background of other people's lives. But the way he looked at me suggested otherwise, like my presence itself had already changed something important. I pushed the document slightly away from me. "I do not understand," I said honestly. For the first time, something shifted in his expression, not softening, but becoming more focused. He stepped closer to the table and placed both hands on its surface, leaning slightly forward so that his eyes were level with mine. "You will," he said, "but not here." My breathing slowed without me realizing it, because the certainty in his voice did not feel like a threat, but it also did not feel like an option. He straightened again and looked toward the door for a brief moment, then back at me. "There are rules you do not know yet," he continued, "and people who will assume you are part of something you are not ready to understand. I felt a strange mixture of confusion and awareness, like I had stepped into a conversation that had started long before I arrived. I finally looked down at the document again, and this time I noticed something at the top. A single line of text with his name printed clearly beside mine. My fingers tensed slightly, but I did not touch it. Ethan spoke again, softer this time, almost controlled enough to sound like reassurance. "This is temporary," he said. "But from this moment, your life is not what it was an hour ago." I looked up at him, trying to find something familiar in his expression, something that made sense of any of it, but there was only calm certainty there, as if he had already accepted an outcome I had not yet realized I was part of. And then he said the words that made everything I thought I understood begin to shift. "You will stay with me until I decide what happens next." I should have been afraid, but what I felt first was something closer to disbelief, because no one had ever spoken about my life like it was already placed inside a plan I had not agreed to. I stayed seated, my hands still in my lap, while Ethan Blackwell stood across from me, as if the room itself belonged to him more than it belonged to reality. The document on the table felt heavier the longer I looked at it, even though I had not touched it again. My thoughts kept circling the same point, trying to find logic where there was none. Stay with him. Decide what happens next. Those words repeated in my mind like they did not belong to the same language I had grown up speaking. I finally asked the question I should have asked earlier. Am I being detained? My voice was steady, but it felt distant, like I was listening to someone else speak. Ethan did not react immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying me again with that same calm attention that made it hard to tell what he was thinking. Then he answered simply, "No," one word. "Clean." "Certain." That should have made things easier, but it did not. It only made everything more unclear. I stood up slowly, because sitting still suddenly felt like surrendering something I did not fully understand yet. "Then I can leave," I said, more as a statement than a question. I reached for my bag, but before I could take a full step, his voice stopped me again. Not louder, just precise enough to make me pause. "You can leave," he said, "but you will not go back to your normal life after tonight." I turned back toward him, confusion tightening in my chest. "I do not even know you," I said, and for the first time, I heard something almost human in my own voice, something closer to frustration than fear. Ethan did not deny it. Instead, he walked a few steps closer, stopping at a distance that still felt controlled, not invasive, but impossible to ignore. "That is not true," he said quietly. "You know enough. You just do not know why yet." I shook my head slightly, because nothing about that made sense. My life had been simple before tonight. Work, rent, survival, repeat. There had been no room for anything like this. No space for documents, or private rooms, or men who spoke like decisions had already been made on my behalf. I looked down at the paper again, and this time I saw details I had missed before. My name, his name, a date that did not belong to any memory I had. My breath caught slightly, but I forced myself to stay grounded. "This is not real," I said, more to myself than to him. Ethan did not argue. Instead, he responded with a calmness that felt heavier than any denial. "It is real," he said. "It is just not something you have been exposed to yet." There was a knock at the door then, sharp but controlled, and it made me turn instinctively. Two men entered, dressed in dark suits, standing just inside the doorway without speaking. They did not look at me directly, but I could feel their awareness of the room. Ethan did not look back at them. He only said, "Give us a moment." They left immediately. No questions. No hesitation. That detail stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. I looked back at Ethan, my pulse steady but alert. "What is this?" I asked again, quieter now. He finally moved to sit across from me, folding his hands in a way that made the entire room feel even more controlled. "You work in a place that is connected to people you do not see," he said. "And last night, you saw something you were not meant to notice." I tried to remember exactly what he meant, but everything from the previous hours felt blurred now, like my mind had been overloaded with too many changes at once. "I did not see anything," I said quickly. Ethan studied me again, and this time there was a slight shift in his expression, not doubt, but certainty that I was not fully understanding the situation yet. "You saw enough," he corrected. "Enough for others to believe you are a problem." That word stayed in the air longer than I wanted it to. Problem. Not threat. Not target. Problem. I felt a strange tightening in my stomach. Not fear exactly, but awareness that my life had just shifted into something I could not reverse by simply walking away. Ethan leaned back slightly, his voice steady again. "You are not in control of the situation you are in right now," he said. "But you will be given choices. That is more than most people get." I stared at him, trying to find something in his tone that sounded like manipulation, but there was none. Only certainty. And that certainty was what unsettled me most. I finally asked, "And what if I refuse all of it?" Ethan did not hesitate. "Then you walk out that door," he said calmly. "And you hope nothing follows you when you do." I remember sitting there longer than I should have, staring at Ethan Blackwell as if looking at him hard enough would somehow turn his words into something simpler, something safer, something I could fit back into the life I had just a few hours ago. But nothing about him softened when I looked closer. If anything, the more I focused, the more I realized how still everything about him was, like he had already lived through every possible outcome of this moment and had chosen his position long before I ever entered the room. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the chair as I tried to steady myself. "You are saying I have no real choice," I said quietly. Ethan did not correct me immediately. Instead, he leaned forward just slightly, resting his forearms on the table in a way that made the space between us feel smaller, but not in a threatening way. It felt deliberate, like he wanted me to hear him clearly without anything between us. "I am saying," he replied, "that your choices exist inside consequences you do not yet understand." I let out a slow breath, trying to process that, but my mind kept circling back to the same point. I was a waitress. I worked double shifts. I worried about rent being late and whether I could afford groceries at the end of the week. I did not belong in conversations like this, and I definitely did not belong in rooms where decisions were made in sentences that sounded like riddles. "I just want to go home," I said finally, and for the first time, I heard exhaustion in my own voice. Ethan studied me for a moment that felt longer than it should have. Then he stood up and walked toward the door. I thought he was going to let me leave. Instead, he opened it and spoke quietly to someone outside. Two men appeared again, the same ones from earlier, and this time, they entered fully. My chest tightened instinctively, but they did not touch me. They only waited. Ethan turned back to me. "You can leave tonight," he said, "but not alone." I frowned slightly. What does that mean? He did not answer directly. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card, placing it on the table in front of me. It was simple, black, no logo, just a number. "If you walk out of here," he continued, "someone will follow you. Not immediately, not obviously, but long enough for you to realize it is happening." I felt my stomach tighten, not because I believed him completely, but because the certainty in his voice made it difficult to dismiss. I shook my head slightly. "Why would anyone follow me?" I asked. Ethan's gaze did not move away from mine. "Because you were present when something sensitive was discussed," he said. "And because people assume witnesses are either useful or dangerous." The word witness made my skin feel cold. I had not witnessed anything important. At least, that was what I kept telling myself. But the more he spoke, the more I started to question my own certainty. I looked down at the card again, then back at him. "And if I stay?" I asked. Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "Then you are protected while we determine what happens next." Protected. The word sounded too clean for the situation I was in. I stood up slowly again, my legs steady but my mind unsettled. "I do not even know what you do," I said. Ethan paused for the first time, just for a second, before answering. "I manage situations that do not belong in public view," he said simply. That explanation did not make anything clearer, but it made everything heavier. I looked toward the door, then back at him. Every instinct I had told me to leave, to return to my apartment, to pretend this night had been nothing more than a strange interruption in my routine. But something in his expression made me hesitate. Not authority, not control, something closer to certainty about a path already in motion. I finally asked, "If I stay, what happens to me?" Ethan stepped closer again, stopping at a distance that felt measured, intentional. "You learn the truth," he said quietly, "and you stop being in the dark about why your life just changed." The room felt quieter after that, like even the air was waiting for my response. I looked at the door one more time, then back at the card on the table. My hand moved slowly toward it, not fully deciding, just acknowledging that whatever came next, I was already standing in the middle of it. I did not realize how heavy silence could feel until I sat in that room with the card still in front of me and Ethan Blackwell watching me like he already knew what I would choose before I made it. My fingers hovered over the edge of the card but did not pick it up yet, as if touching it would make everything final. The two men by the door stayed still, not speaking, not moving, just present in a way that made the room feel smaller than it actually was. I finally broke the silence again because it was the only thing I could control. "If I take this," I said quietly, "what exactly changes for me tonight?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at me for a moment that felt longer than it should have, then walked slowly toward the table and placed both hands on it, leaning slightly forward. "Tonight," he said, "you are no longer just someone who works a shift and goes home." I frowned slightly, because that answer still did not explain anything in a way my mind could organize. "That is not an answer," I said. He nodded once, acknowledging it. "It is the only version of the truth that matters right now." I felt my frustration rise, not at him exactly, but at the situation itself, at the fact that my life was being spoken about like it belonged to a system I had never agreed to be part of. "I am not part of your world," I said. My voice was steady, but I could hear the tension underneath it. Ethan's expression did not change. "You already are," he replied. That sentence made something in my chest tighten because he said it with certainty, not persuasion. Like it was not something he wanted, but something he had already accepted as fact. I looked down at the card again, then finally picked it up. It was simple, black, smooth, almost weightless, but it felt heavier than anything I had held that night. I turned it between my fingers slowly. "If I call this number," I said, "what happens?" Ethan straightened slightly. "Someone will answer," he said, "and you will be given instructions." I let out a slow breath, trying to ground myself in something familiar. Instructions. That word made everything feel even less like my life and more like something structured, controlled, already in motion. "And if I do not call?" I asked. There was a brief pause before he answered. "Then you go home," he said simply. "And you hope that nothing in your life changes because of what you were exposed to tonight." I looked up at him, searching his face for exaggeration or manipulation, but there was none. Only calm certainty, like he was describing weather instead of consequences. I thought about my apartment, the small space I could barely afford, the routine I had built just to survive. It felt distant now, like something belonging to someone else. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked quietly. Ethan stepped back slightly from the table, giving me space without fully removing himself from the moment. "Because you deserve to understand the reality you stepped into," he said. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else he had said so far. Not because it was comforting, but because it suggested I had already crossed a point of no return without realizing it. I held the card tighter, then finally placed it back on the table. "I need time," I said. Ethan nodded once, as if he expected that answer too. "You have tonight," he replied. One of the men by the door finally moved, opening it slightly, and I felt the shift immediately, like the room was offering me an exit it had already prepared for. I walked toward it slowly, every step deliberate, every thought scattered. Before I reached the door, I stopped and turned back. "If I leave," I said, "will I see you again?" Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time, something unreadable passed through his expression, not emotion, but recognition of something already decided. "Yes," he said simply, "but not the same way." I did not fully understand what that meant, but I knew enough to feel it was not a promise I could ignore. I stepped through the door, and the hallway felt colder than before, like the world outside that room was no longer the same one I had entered hours earlier. I walked out of that hallway slower than I expected, not because I was calm, but because my body felt like it was moving without fully agreeing with me anymore. The sound of the door closing behind me was soft, but it carried more weight than it should have, like it marked the end of something I had not yet fully understood. The lounge was still alive with noise, music, and distant conversations, but everything felt slightly disconnected, like I was hearing it from underwater. I tightened my grip on my bag and moved toward the staff exit, telling myself that leaving would reset everything, that once I stepped outside, the night would start making sense again. But even as I pushed through the door and felt the cold air hit my face, nothing returned to normal. The city outside looked the same, but I did not feel like I belonged to it in the same way anymore. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure if I should call a ride or just walk until my thoughts settled, but my phone buzzed before I made a decision. Unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Hello, I said quietly. There was a pause on the other end, then a calm voice that I recognized immediately, even though I had only heard it a few times. You left, Ethan Blackwell said. I looked around instinctively, though I knew that was pointless. You said I could, I replied. I did, he said, but I also said it would not feel the same afterward. I stepped slightly away from the entrance, my eyes scanning the street, trying to understand how he had my number already. Why are you calling me? I asked. His voice remained steady, almost clinical in its calmness. Because you are outside now, he said, and I need to confirm you are not being followed. That sentence made my chest tighten in a way I did not expect. I stopped walking completely. Followed by who? I asked. There was a brief silence on the line before he answered. By the people who were in that room before you left mine, he said. I felt my stomach drop slightly, not because I fully understood it, but because the way he said it made it sound like a fact instead of a possibility. I turned slowly, looking down the sidewalk, noticing details I would normally ignore. A parked car across the street. A man standing too still near the corner. A second vehicle idling farther down the block. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was creating patterns out of fear, but the feeling did not go away. I do not see anything, I said quietly. That is fine, Ethan replied. If you noticed it clearly, it would already be too late. I did not like the way that sounded, but I could not find a reason to dismiss it either. I started walking again, faster this time, trying to blend into the flow of the street, but every step felt slightly heavier than the last. What do you want from me? I asked finally. My voice was lower now, more controlled, but I could still hear the tension underneath it. Ethan did not answer immediately. When he did, his tone shifted slightly, not softer, but more direct. I want you to follow simple instructions until I know you are not in danger, he said. I stopped again. You are asking me to trust you, I said. There was a pause on the line, longer this time, before he responded. No, he said. I am telling you what is already happening whether you agree with it or not. That sentence made everything feel narrower, like my options were shrinking without me seeing the edges. I looked down the street again, my thoughts moving faster than I could organize them. If I do not listen? I asked. Ethan's voice remained calm. Then you rely on chance, he said. And I do not recommend that tonight. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to steady myself, trying to separate fear from logic, but they were starting to blend together. When I opened them again, I noticed a car slowly moving past the intersection at the end of the block, then turning without signaling. It was small details like that, things I would normally ignore, that suddenly felt different. I kept walking, but I did not hang up the call. Where are you right now? I asked. Close, he said simply. I did not ask him to explain. I was not sure I wanted to know. Instead, I said the only thing that felt real in that moment. I am going home, I said. Ethan did not stop me. Do not take the usual route, he replied. And for the first time since I left the lounge, I realized that my night had not ended when I walked out of that building. It had only moved into a place I could no longer see clearly. I did not take the usual route, even though my mind kept trying to argue that it would not matter, that it was just another street, another walk home, another night I would forget after sleep. But nothing about that night felt like something I could simply forget anymore. I stayed on the phone with Ethan Blackwell, his presence reduced to a calm voice that somehow made the silence around me feel more structured than empty. Walk east instead, he said. I turned without thinking too long about it, because thinking too long made everything worse. The streets were not crowded, but they were not empty either, and every passing car made my attention sharpen in ways I was not used to. I kept my pace steady, trying to look normal, trying to act like I was just another person going home after a long shift. But the feeling of being observed did not leave me. It stayed just beneath awareness, like background noise I could not fully filter out. You are almost clear, Ethan said after a while. I exhaled slowly, though I was not sure why I trusted that word. Clear. It sounded too final, too certain for something I could not see. Almost, I repeated quietly. Almost, he confirmed. I turned a corner onto a quieter street, and the city suddenly felt different again, less like noise and more like distance. That was when I saw the car. It was parked too cleanly at the curb, engine off, no movement inside, but something about it made me slow down without realizing it. I did not stop walking, but my pace changed. My grip on my phone tightened slightly. I think there is a vehicle near me, I said quietly. There was a pause before Ethan responded. Do not look directly at it, he said. I frowned slightly. Why not? Because awareness confirms interest, he said simply. That answer made no sense at first, but I followed it anyway, keeping my gaze forward while my senses tried to process everything at once. I passed the car slowly, feeling my heartbeat increase even though nothing had happened. The moment I got past it, I felt a strange shift, like I had crossed a line without knowing where it was drawn. Keep walking, Ethan said. I did. The next few minutes felt longer than they should have. Every block looked similar, but not identical, like the city had been slightly rearranged while I was not paying attention. I kept expecting something to happen, some obvious event that would confirm I was imagining everything, but nothing did. That was what made it worse. The absence of certainty. Why are you helping me? I asked suddenly, because the question had been building since I left the lounge, and I could no longer hold it back. Ethan did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had shifted slightly, less clinical, more grounded. Because you did not belong in that situation, he said. I slowed my pace again. I do not belong in most situations I end up in, I replied without thinking. There was a brief silence on the line. Then he said, that is not true. I almost laughed at that, but it came out more like disbelief. You barely know me, I said. I know enough, he replied. I looked up ahead and saw my apartment building in the distance, and for the first time that night, something in my chest loosened slightly. I am home, I said. Ethan's voice remained steady. Go inside, he said. I stopped at the entrance for a moment, looking up at the building I had always considered safe, or at least familiar. Now it felt like just another place in a city I no longer fully trusted. And then what? I asked. There was a pause before he answered, and when he did, his words were quieter but more certain than before. And then you wait until I contact you again, he said. I hesitated, my hand on the door. If I do not answer, I said, what happens? His response was immediate. Then I come to you, he said simply. That answer stayed in the air longer than anything else he had said that night. I finally opened the door and stepped inside, the warm light of the lobby hitting my face, but it did not feel like relief. It felt like the end of one unknown and the beginning of another I had not agreed to enter. And as the door closed behind me, I realized the part one could not ignore anymore was not where I was going, but the fact that I was no longer going there alone. I stood inside my apartment building lobby for a few seconds longer than necessary, not because I felt safe, but because I did not know what safety was supposed to feel like anymore after hearing Ethan Blackwell's voice follow me all the way home. The doors behind me closed with a soft mechanical sound, and that sound felt louder than it should have, like it marked a separation I could not undo. I kept my eyes on the elevator instead of looking back outside, because looking back felt like admitting something I did not fully understand. The lobby was quiet, normal, almost too normal, like nothing in the world had shifted except for me. I pressed the elevator button and waited, my fingers still slightly tense around my phone. There was no new message. No call. Only silence. That silence made my thoughts louder again. When the elevator arrived, I stepped inside quickly, pressing the button for my floor without hesitation, even though hesitation had been the only thing guiding me all night. The doors closed, and for a brief moment, I thought I could finally breathe again. But then my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I already knew it would be him before I answered. Are you inside? Ethan's voice asked. I leaned slightly against the elevator wall, exhaling slowly. Yes, I said. There was a pause on the line, like he was confirming something I could not see. Good, he said finally. I frowned slightly. How do you know I made it inside? I asked. His answer came without delay. Because I am watching the building, he said calmly. That sentence should have made me panic. Instead, it made my thoughts slow down in a strange way, like my mind was trying to process how to respond to something that did not fit into normal rules. You are what? I asked quietly. Not inside, he clarified. Nearby. The elevator stopped at my floor, and I stepped out slowly, my apartment door just a short walk down the hallway. Every step felt more deliberate now, like I was aware of my surroundings in a way I had never been before. Why would you do that? I asked. There was a brief silence before he responded. Because I told you I would, he said simply. I stopped in front of my door, my hand hovering over the lock, but not turning it yet. I did not ask for this, I said. Ethan did not disagree. I know, he replied. That answer unsettled me more than anything else. I finally opened the door and stepped inside, locking it behind me immediately. My apartment looked exactly the same as it always did, small, quiet, slightly messy in the corners. I never fully organized because I was too tired to care. But now it felt different, like the space had become smaller in a way that had nothing to do with its size. I set my bag down slowly and kept the phone in my hand. What happens now? I asked. Ethan's voice remained steady. Now you stay where you are, he said. I looked toward my window instinctively, though I knew I would not see anything from this height. And if I do not want to stay? I asked. There was a pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his tone changed slightly, not harsher, but more serious. Then you risk repeating what just happened tonight without guidance, he said. I sat down on the edge of my couch, trying to understand how my life had shifted into a situation where guidance was even a concept I needed. You keep saying I am in danger, I said quietly, but I do not even know from what. Ethan did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice lowered slightly. You saw something tonight that connects you to people you do not know, he said. And people do not ignore connections like that. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to remember every detail from earlier, every face, every moment that now felt like it belonged to a different version of my life. I did not do anything, I said. I was just working. That is not what matters, Ethan replied. I opened my eyes again and looked around my apartment as if expecting it to explain something to me. Then what matters? I asked. There was a pause before he answered, and when he did, his voice carried something I had not heard clearly before. Not control, not certainty, something closer to concern. That you are now part of a tension you did not choose, he said. I went silent after that, because I did not know how to respond to a sentence like that. My grip on the phone loosened slightly. Outside my window, the city continued as if nothing had changed, cars moving, lights shifting, people living lives that still made sense. But inside my apartment, nothing felt normal anymore. Are you still there? I asked quietly after a moment. Yes, he said. I hesitated before speaking again. Why me? I asked, not for the first time, but now with less confusion and more exhaustion. Ethan's answer came after a pause that felt intentional. Because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, he said. And because now that it happened, you cannot be unseen. I leaned back slightly, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of that settle in a way I did not fully accept yet. And for the first time since I met him, I realized the most unsettling part was not what he was offering me, but the fact that walking away no longer felt like something that would return me to the life I used to know. I did not sleep that night, even though I told myself I would, because every time I closed my eyes I kept hearing Ethan Blackwell's voice as if it had stayed inside the walls of my apartment instead of outside of it. I sat on my couch for a long time, staring at nothing in particular, waiting for my thoughts to organize themselves into something logical, but nothing became clear. Everything felt slightly displaced, like my normal life had been pushed a few inches out of alignment, and I could not figure out how to move it back. My phone stayed on the table in front of me, screen dark, silent, and that silence felt more intentional than before. Around 2:17 in the morning, it vibrated once. Unknown number again. I hesitated only briefly before answering. I told you I was home, I said immediately, before he could speak. There was a short pause, then Ethan's voice came through, steady as always. I know, he replied. I leaned forward slightly, pressing my elbows against my knees. Then why are you still calling me? I asked. Another pause. Because the situation has changed, he said. I frowned. Changed how? He did not answer directly at first. Instead, I heard faint background noise on his side, something like wind or distance movement, but nothing I could clearly identify. Someone tried to access your building records earlier tonight, he said finally. My body stiffened slightly. My building records? I repeated. Why would anyone care about that? They are not interested in the building, he said calmly. They are interested in you. I stood up slowly, walking toward my window without fully realizing it. The street below was quiet, only a few distant headlights passing occasionally. That does not make sense, I said quietly. Ethan did not respond immediately, and the silence that followed made my chest tighten slightly. You are not supposed to have visibility, he said after a moment. Not yet. I turned back toward the room. Visibility into what? I asked. There was another pause, longer this time. Into who you were near tonight, he said. I stopped moving completely. I was serving tables. I said, more firmly this time. That is all I did. That is not what matters anymore, he replied. I felt frustration rising now, not fear exactly, but something closer to exhaustion. Then tell me what does matter, I said. My voice was sharper than before. Ethan's tone remained unchanged. What matters is that you were seen, he said. And now you are accounted for. I let out a slow breath, pressing my fingers lightly against my forehead, as if that would help organize my thoughts. I do not belong to anyone, I said. There was a brief silence before Ethan responded. I did not say you did, he replied. That answer caught me off guard. I lowered my hand slightly. Then what are you saying? I asked. His voice remained calm, but there was something more deliberate in it now. I am saying that there are systems in place that respond to observation, he said. And you were observed in a context that creates interest. I sat back down slowly, my mind struggling to translate what he was saying into anything familiar. Systems. Observation. Interest. None of it felt real, but none of it felt dismissible either. You keep speaking like I should understand this, I said quietly. But I do not. You will, he replied simply. I looked toward my door instinctively, as if expecting it to change in response to this conversation. Are you telling me I cannot go back to my normal life? I asked. There was a pause before he answered, and when he did, his tone shifted slightly, not softer, but more precise. I am telling you that your normal life is no longer insulated from what is now connected to you, he said. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to process that sentence without letting it overwhelm me. And what exactly is connected to me? I asked. Ethan did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice lowered slightly. People who operate outside the systems you are familiar with, he said. That answer made my stomach tighten slightly again, not because it was clear, but because it was not. So what am I supposed to do? I asked quietly. There was a brief pause before he answered. You do not make decisions alone right now, he said. I opened my eyes again. That is not an answer, I said. It is a condition, he replied. I stood up again, pacing slowly across my small living room, trying to find something stable in my surroundings. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Why are you involved in this? I asked suddenly. There was a pause on the line, longer than before, and when Ethan finally spoke, his voice changed just slightly. Because I recognized what others would misunderstand, he said. I stopped walking. And what is that? I asked. His answer came after a moment of silence. That you are not meant to be ignored, he said. I did not respond immediately, because something about that sentence made my thoughts pause. Not comfort, not fear. Something closer to uncertainty about what kind of future that implied. I finally sat back down, the phone still pressed to my ear. I do not know what you expect from me, I said quietly. Ethan's voice remained steady. I expect you to stay where you are for now, he said. I looked around my apartment again, suddenly aware of how small it felt. And if I do not? I asked. There was a brief silence before he answered. Then the situation adjusts without preparation, he said. That answer stayed with me longer than anything else that night. I did not respond immediately, and neither did he. For the first time, the silence between us felt less like absence and more like something waiting. I remember staring at my phone long after Ethan Blackwell stopped speaking, because even though the line was still open, the silence between us felt heavier than any words he had said before. It was not an absence of communication anymore. It felt like a pause in something larger that I was only now beginning to notice. I finally broke the silence because I could not stand waiting in it. What happens if I ignore everything you are saying? I asked quietly. There was a delay on the line, not technical, but intentional, like he was choosing his words carefully. Then you return to a version of your life that assumes nothing has changed, he said, while the environment around you continues to update without your awareness. I closed my eyes briefly, pressing my fingers against my forehead again. You make it sound like I am part of something I cannot see, I said. Ethan responded immediately this time. You are, he said simply. That one word stayed in my mind longer than it should have. I stood up from the couch again and walked toward the kitchen, not because I needed anything, but because staying still felt harder than moving. My apartment felt smaller than it had ever felt before, like the walls were closer than I remembered. I do not understand how I got into this, I said. My voice was quieter now, Ethan's tone remained steady. You did not enter it intentionally, he said. That is why you are still trying to interpret it using familiar logic. I leaned against the counter, looking down at the surface without really seeing it. So what am I supposed to do while I wait for this logic to make sense? I asked. There was a brief pause before he answered. You observe carefully, he said, and you do not assume you are safe simply because nothing is happening. I let out a slow breath. Nothing is happening, I repeated. Ethan's voice lowered slightly. That is the most dangerous assumption you can make right now, he said. I did not respond immediately because I was trying to decide whether that statement was meant to scare me or prepare me. Neither option felt comforting. I walked back toward the living room slowly, my eyes scanning the window again instinctively. The street outside looked unchanged, but I was no longer convinced that appearance meant anything. You keep telling me I am being watched, I said quietly, but I have not seen anything concrete. Ethan replied without hesitation. You would not, he said. Not unless it was already too late. That answer made my chest tighten slightly again, not because I understood it, but because I could not fully dismiss it either. I sat down again, placing my phone carefully on my knee as if it might react to my thoughts. What do you want from me, Ethan? I asked. This time there was a longer silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, not louder, not softer, but more deliberate. I want you to remain reachable, he said. I frowned slightly. Reachable for what? I asked. For confirmation, he replied. That you are still in a controlled environment. I let out a small, almost disbelieving breath. My apartment is not a controlled environment, I said. Ethan did not argue immediately. Instead, he responded with a calm certainty that made me pause. It is controlled enough for now, he said. I leaned back slightly, staring at the ceiling again, trying to find a version of this conversation that made sense in the world I used to understand. This feels like something I was pulled into without agreeing, I said quietly. Ethan answered after a short pause. Most people do not agree before they are affected, he said. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. I sat in silence for a moment, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside my window, trying to separate normal life from whatever I was now supposed to understand. How long does this last? I asked finally. There was a pause on the line before Ethan answered. Until the variables stabilize, he said. I closed my eyes again. That is not an answer, I said. Ethan did not disagree. It is the only one that applies right now, he replied. I opened my eyes slowly, looking around my apartment one more time, noticing details I had ignored for years suddenly feel unfamiliar. The couch, the kitchen light, the quiet hallway beyond my door. Everything looked the same, but I no longer trusted that sameness. And until then, I asked quietly. Ethan's response came immediately, calm and certain. Until then, he said, you follow instructions and you do not isolate yourself. I sat there holding the phone, realizing that even though I was physically alone, I was no longer being treated as someone who could simply disappear back in a normal life. And that realization made the silence in my apartment feel like it was no longer empty, but occupied by something I still could not see. I stopped counting how many times I checked my phone that night, because every vibration felt less like a notification and more like a shift in the structure of my reality. After Ethan Blackwell's last message, I had not moved far from my couch. I sat there, staring at the dim light of my apartment, trying to convince myself that nothing had actually changed outside of my perception. But the longer I stayed awake, the less convincing that idea became. Around 3:08 in the morning, my phone lit up again. Unknown number. I answered immediately this time. Are you still there? Ethan's voice asked. I exhaled slowly. I did not go anywhere, I said. There was a short pause. Good, he replied. I leaned back slightly, rubbing my forehead as fatigue began to settle in. Why does it matter so much that I stay reachable? I asked quietly. Ethan did not respond immediately, and I could hear faint background noise again, like movement or distant wind, but nothing clear enough to identify. Because the situation is still active, he said finally. I frowned slightly. You keep saying that, I replied. But nothing is happening. There was another pause before his voice came through, lower this time. That is because nothing visible is happening, he said. I looked toward my window again instinctively, even though I told myself not to. The street outside remained unchanged, quiet, still. So what am I supposed to do while I wait for something invisible? I asked. Ethan answered without hesitation. You do not wait passively, he said. You stay aware. I let out a small breath, half frustration, half disbelief. Aware of what exactly? I asked. There was a moment of silence before he responded. Of changes in behavior around you, he said. Of inconsistencies in your environment. I closed my eyes briefly. This sounds like I am supposed to believe my entire life is unstable, I said. Ethan's tone remained calm. Not your life, he corrected. Your context. That word stayed in my mind for a moment. Context. It sounded abstract, but the way he said it made it feel specific, like something structured I could not yet see. I stood up and walked slowly toward the window again, looking out at the city below. Everything looked normal, but normal no longer felt like proof of safety. I feel like I am being asked to accept things without understanding them, I said quietly. Ethan did not deny it. Understanding comes after exposure, he replied. I leaned my forehead lightly against the glass, trying to steady myself. And what counts as exposure? I asked. There was a pause before he answered. Confirmation that what I told you aligns with what you observe, he said. I stayed quiet for a moment, watching a car pass slowly down the street below. I do not know what I am supposed to be looking for, I admitted. Ethan's voice softened slightly, not emotionally, but in precision. You are not looking for anything specific, he said. You are noticing when things do not match expectation. I turned away from the window and walked back to the couch, sitting down slowly. This is exhausting, I said quietly. There was a pause on the line. I know, Ethan replied. That was the first time his response sounded slightly less detached, and it caught my attention more than anything else he had said that night. I rubbed my hands together slowly, trying to ground myself. How long do I have to stay in this state of awareness? I asked. Ethan answered after a moment. Until I say otherwise, he said. I let out a slow breath. And if I do not want to? I asked. There was a longer silence this time, and when he spoke again, his tone returned to its earlier calm certainty. Then you lose structured oversight, he said. I frowned slightly. Structured oversight? I repeated. Protection, he clarified. I looked down at my hands for a moment, thinking about how quickly words like that had entered my life without warning. Protection, oversight, context. None of it belonged to the world I had known before tonight. I do not know what you are protecting me from, I said quietly. Ethan did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but more direct. You are not expected to know yet, he said. I leaned back into the couch again, staring at the ceiling as silence filled the line between us. It did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, like something was being held in place without being fully revealed. Are you still outside? I asked after a while. There was a brief pause before he answered. Yes, he said. I hesitated. Why? I asked. His response came immediately. Because tonight is not finished, he said. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I understood something clearly, even if I could not explain it yet. I was no longer just being spoken to. I was being positioned inside something that was still unfolding. I stayed on the couch longer than I realized, holding the phone loosely in my hand while the silence on the other end of the line continued even after Ethan Blackwell stopped speaking. It was not a disconnected silence. It felt intentional, like the conversation had not ended, but simply paused somewhere between his world and mine. I finally broke it because I could not stand waiting inside it. Why are you still outside my building? I asked quietly. There was a brief pause before his voice returned, calm as always. Because the situation has not concluded, he said. I leaned forward slightly, pressing my elbows into my knees. Nothing is happening, I repeated, though now even I was less certain of that statement than before. Ethan did not respond immediately. When he did, his tone was lower, more precise. Nothing visible is happening, he said. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting out a slow breath. That does not help me understand anything, I said. Understanding is not the priority yet, he replied. I opened my eyes again and stared at the dim glow of my apartment, trying to find something stable in it. Then what is the priority? I asked. There was a pause, longer than before. Stability, he said. I frowned slightly. My stability or yours? I asked. Ethan answered without hesitation. Yours, he said. That answer should have been reassuring, but instead it made everything feel even more unclear, because I was starting to realize that stability in his language did not mean what it meant in mine. I stood up slowly and walked toward the window again, looking down at the empty street. Everything looked ordinary, unchanged, and that was exactly what made it feel strange now. I feel like I am being watched even when I do not see anything, I admitted quietly. There was a brief pause before Ethan responded. That is because awareness has increased, he said. I leaned my forehead lightly against the glass, trying to steady my thoughts. You are not helping me feel normal, I said. Normal is not the current objective, he replied. I turned away from the window again, my frustration building slightly. Then what is the objective? I asked. Ethan's voice softened just slightly, not emotionally, but in clarity. Containment of uncertainty, he said. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but it did not fully form. That sounds like I am part of a system, I said. There was a pause before he answered. You are interacting with one, he said simply. I sat back down on the couch, suddenly aware of how tired I felt, not just physically, but in a way that went deeper, like my mind had been holding tension for too long without release. I do not understand how I got here, I said quietly. Ethan did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was lower than before. You were placed in proximity to an event that created visibility, he said. I closed my eyes briefly. I was just working a shift, I said. That is all. That is how it started, he replied. I opened my eyes again and looked at my phone like it might explain something if I stared long enough. And now? I asked. There was a pause on the line. Now you are inside awareness parameters, he said. I shook my head slightly. That does not sound real, I said. Ethan did not argue. Reality does not require agreement, he replied. I leaned back into the couch again, staring at the ceiling. The apartment felt quieter now, not because anything had changed outside, but because I had started listening differently to everything inside it. What happens next? I asked quietly. Ethan's answer came after a short pause. Observation continues, he said. I frowned slightly. By who? I asked. There was a moment of silence before he responded. By both sides, he said. That sentence made my chest tighten slightly, because it implied something I was not ready to define. I am not on any side, I said quietly. Ethan's voice remained steady. That has not been determined yet, he said. I sat still for a moment, letting that sink in, though it did not settle into anything familiar. And what am I supposed to do while this is happening? I asked. Ethan answered immediately. You remain reachable, he said. I looked down at my phone again. And if I do not? I asked. There was a brief pause before he replied. Then the structure adjusts without your input, he said. I closed my eyes again, exhaling slowly. The words did not feel threatening, but they did not feel safe either. They felt like something already in motion that I had only just become aware of. When I opened my eyes again, I realized something I had been avoiding since this began. My life had not been interrupted. It had been reclassified. And somewhere outside my apartment, Ethan Blackwell was still there, not waiting for me to decide what to do next, but waiting for me to understand that the decision had already started without me.